Israel just spent 15 months razing Gaza to the ground. And you think after spending 15 months razing Gaza to the ground, they're suddenly going to hold hands, sing Kumbaya, and rebuild Gaza? These Jewish billionaire supremacists demand the right to commit genocide. That's at heart what's going on. I know Trump doesn't like wokeness. Mr. Vance doesn't like wokeness. Do you think they care about Middle East studies departments? No. They don't know what the Middle East is. They look for it in the map of the United States. There's no war in Gaza. There's an extermination in Gaza. I think Israel just announced the 400th casualty. And that's what Israel is doing now. Turn it into that hellhole and communicating the torture is not over. We'll keep turning the screws and turning the screws until you scream and you're ready to go.
On October 7th, 2024, we released an episode where we revisited the first year of the war, which was still ongoing. When we last spoke in February, it had ended. But as of now, as we're sitting down, it's begun again and going full force. So I've got two questions. One, just as a bit of a recap, what happened in the immediate past that brought us from ceasefire to where we are now? And second, when we last spoke, you said that Gaza was no more. And if Gaza's no more, then how is this war still ongoing?
Obviously the break came when President Trump was elected into office and there was a ceasefire declared. Now that ceasefire was supposed to have three components. Component number one was the exchange of the hostages for the detainees, the Israeli hostages for the Palestinian detainees. Number two, an infusion of humanitarian aid. And number three, reconstruction. I said at the time that I believe number one will happen, namely the exchange of hostages for detainees. I didn't believe number two would happen, and I didn't believe number three would happen, based on the historical record and based on Israel's avowed policies since October 7th, or avowed objectives and policies since October 7th. So nothing that happened has particularly surprised me. President Trump wanted to claim victory or claim he decisively affected the hostage question, because he had said it a month before he got into office. He said, unless the hostages are released, it will be all hell to pay in Gaza. Now, all hell had already been paid in Gaza. There really wasn't very much left for hell to pay. So he only had one other real option if he didn't want to sound like a blowhard. And the option was to instruct Netanyahu, you're going to have to go through the hostage for detainee exchange, which had been on the drawing board for a very long time, I guess since July of 2024, but which Israel had rejected. So that way Trump can claim he got the hostages released. He wouldn't sound like a blowhard. But he didn't care about the rest, the humanitarian aid and the reconstruction of Gaza, which was never going to happen. So what happened was there was a partial hostage detainee exchange, a very partial one. And Trump basically then turned the other way. And Israel does what it always does. So it has two components. First of all, your listeners might recall, or the audience might recall, that Israel's initial order was no food, fuel, water, or electricity would be admitted to Gaza. And we're right back there now. No food, fuel, water, or electricity is being admitted to Gaza. So we're right back to where we were October 15th, when at that time, Defense Minister Gallant gave that order. So we're right back there. And the second thing is, the Israelis are very sensitive to American headlines. They're very sensitive to publicity in the United States. Gaza was for quite a while above the fold, as we used to say in our generation, meaning you have the newspaper. In order to read it, you had to fold it. And above the fold meant when you folded, here's the newspaper, when you folded it, above the fold meant basically where the headlines on the front page were. And Gaza was above the fold for quite a long time, much longer than I ever expected it to be, mostly because in the spring of the student encampments, which began to spread with a considerable rapidity. So Gaza has been replaced in the headlines. And what's been replaced by, it's Trump. Trump, Trump, Trump. We're back to the era of Nancy Pelosi and the resistance, where every headline is Trump. Every single headline is Trump. There's nothing else. And so Israel now is off the hook.
Right.
It doesn't have to worry about headlines. So it's able to resume its genocide in Gaza. So the two main factors, just to summarize, were Trump was only committed to the exchange of hostages for detainees. I don't like the word detainees. It was hostages for hostages. But I'm just saying it because that's the language it's described, and I don't want to confuse the listener, the audience. So he was never committed to phase 2 or 3. He had made a commitment about the hostages. That was all he was interested in. And Israel, as always, it exploits the opportunity. Israel is very good at exploiting the opportunities. In particular, Prime Minister Netanyahu. He knows the American scene. He knows the American landscape very well because he lived here. And he seems to be a reasonably intelligent person, I can't judge. So they're just resuming where they left off. And it never had anything, in my opinion. Okay, I don't want to be hyperbolic about it. The Hamas part, defeating Hamas, was always a trivial part. I won't say it was no part, but it was always a trivial part of what Israel has been doing since October 7th. The main goal is to, so to speak, liquidate the Gaza question, to solve the Gaza problem. That's been its main goal. And you could say it's getting quite close now. The demonstrations, I don't know how large they are. I don't follow it closely, but they're an indication that the people are fed up. And the estimates now, the last estimate I read is that 1/4 of the population is ready to leave, according to public opinion polls. So they're getting close to achieving their goal. They need a little more time. Their goal being to liquidate the Gaza question. And that basically, as I've said in the past, had 3 components. 1 was outright extermination, 2 was ethnic cleansing, and 3 was making Gaza unlivable. And it's almost there.
One of the most fascinating aspects of that response was you mentioned that Trump is the title of every headline right now. And in asking this question, I wasn't...
By the way, that was the New York Times in 2016 on also. Every headline was Trump. There's nothing else in the front page anymore.
But what I found particularly interesting was that's also how you began your response about why the war resumed. So it's no mistake.
There's no war in Gaza. I don't want to trip you up on every linguistic phrase, but there's no war in Gaza. There's an extermination in Gaza. There's been less than one casualty. I think Israel just announced the 400th casualty. There's been less than one casualty a day. There's no fighting in Gaza. There's an extermination going on.
But Israel and the United States and Trump are for you one entity in a certain way.
The United States, obviously, we know that from the day Trump got into office. He imposed a ceasefire. He just, as I said, for him, he didn't want to come across as a blowhard. He said there was going to be all hell to pay. But on the other hand, he had made a commitment the hostages would be released. So it's now commonly accepted that the U.S., this fellow Witkoff, gave Prime Minister Netanyahu the marching orders. There's going to be a ceasefire, and it was over. That's why I'm amused, This is a side note, and I recognize we'll get to it later. So I was reading Chuck Schumer's new book, Anti-Semitism in America, and he says that he was working hard for humanitarian aid to get in, and he was working hard to soften the Israeli assault on Gaza. He didn't have power. The entire book, this little book of his, the entire book, we'll get to it later, but the entire book is him boasting that he's the most powerful Jew in American history. It's like every 5 pages he keeps reminding the reader, I am, so to speak, the king of the Jews. I'm the most powerful Jew in American history. And you had no power to affect what was going on in Gaza. Mr. Biden, who also claimed he was working hard for humanitarian assistance. Ms. Kamala Harris, who was working day and night for a ceasefire. Mr. Blinken, they had no power. And Trump in 1 hour just sends his envoy, Mr. Witkoff, who has no diplomatic training at all. It's just a golf friend, not a golf friend of Mr. Trump's. He just tells him, ceasefire. Of course they had the power. They chose not to exercise it. And Trump exercised it, but remember, for very idiosyncratic, personalized reasons. He had staked his reputation on bringing back the hostages, all hell to pay, and he had to get results. But once he didn't care about the humanitarian aid and Gaza reconstruction. That was for me, I guess people just don't know the history. It was just so ludicrous. Israel just spent 15 months leveling Gaza, razing Gaza to the ground. And you think after spending 15 months razing Gaza to the ground, they're suddenly going to hold hands, sing Kumbaya, and rebuild Gaza? It's just nutty that anybody could possibly believe these things.
Now, this raises a very curious question, which is why, if people like Schumer, Harris, and Biden, prominent members of the Democratic Party, which ostensibly wants to represent itself as the representative of the oppressed and the people, and I think in the global space, that is precisely what the Palestinians represent. Why, if they had this power that Trump was able to execute, you said immediately, did they not execute their own power to enforce a ceasefire when they had plenty of time before Trump came into office?
Because largely, not entirely, but largely, there was an overlap of U.S. and Israeli interests, because Israel is plays a critical role in defending U.S. interests in the region. And on October 7th, it's what they call the Israeli expression. Their deterrence capability was significantly undermined. This ragtag guerrilla army in this tiny patch of land had executed a military operation which seemed to reveal that Israel wasn't the invincible power, this high-tech, cutting-edge military power with this fantastical surveillance capacity and technological capacity, that it wasn't quite what it had been believed. And so the U.S. was completely committed to, using again the language of the Israelis, to restore Israel's deterrence capability, which basically means restoring the Arab world's fear of Israel. So there was a significant overlap there. Of course, the overlap didn't include necessarily the genocidal destruction of Gaza. It included an element of that because the way Israel restores its deterrence capacity, in the past it restored its deterrence capacity by being impressive on the battlefield. So 1948, 1967, they seemed like significant, what you would call conventional military victories on the battlefield, okay? But then Israel ceased to be a fighting army, became very westernized. And becoming very westernized means you'd rather be in a disco than to die in a dirt heap or dirt ditch. So it became a remote control killing machine. And a remote control killing machine meant basically you restore your deterrence capability by inflicting a massive amount of death and destruction on the civilian population. It was no longer about defeating an enemy army. It was fundamentally about wreaking death and destruction on the civilian population. So the U.S. accepted that part of restoring Israel's deterrence capability, the Arab world's fear of it, would have to include massive death and destruction in Gaza. But it didn't necessarily mean an outright genocide. The Israelis decided that they had enough with, quote unquote, mowing the lawn in Gaza, that this time they would extirpate, pull out by the root, every blade of grass in Gaza, that they would, as I've said, solve the Gaza question. So there was a large overlap of interest. In the case of former President Biden, there seemed to be some emotional component to it. He has 3 daughters. All of them are married to Jews. And I suspect there was a osmosis effect, you would say, by that fact. And then there's the question of money, campaign contributions and so forth. That factor, I would say, in the case of Gaza was secondary. However, I would say in the current assault, full-blown assault on academic freedom and the independence of the universities, I would say the money factor has been the critical factor. if you follow currently the attacks on Trump for the encroachments on academic freedom and so forth, it's a very funny thing to behold. I have to say, it amuses me because it whites out everything that came before. The encroachments didn't start now. They started under the Biden administration. Why did they begin? It was straightforward. The Jewish supremacist billionaire class, people like Bill Ackman, Barry Sternlicht, Robert Kraft, Sheryl Sandberg, the Jewish supremacist billionaire class wanted to crush the encampments. And they made it very clear that was their objective. By the way, Chuck Schumer went along with all of that. He still does. He has no reservations, qualms, caveats. There are quite a few passages in his book on not just Colombia, but Colombia. And Colombia, in his telling, is a hotbed of anti-Semitism. There are all of these ghastly incidents of anti-Semitism on Columbia campus. 95% of it probably confected. 5% may be true, but that still is 5%. So the whole assault on academic freedom didn't begin with Trump. It began with the Jewish supremacist billionaire class. It was then acquiesced in by the Biden administration. When the president of Harvard was ousted, the president of Harvard University was ousted. The president of University of Pennsylvania was ousted. The president of Columbia was effectively ousted. Did you hear any denunciations about violations of academic freedom by the Biden administration? Was there any? I don't recall one word. It's not Trump. Now it's true. It's intensified under Trump. And now they're going after the Middle East studies discipline. They're going after individuals. That's true. But there's another element that's completely absent from all the discussion. Let's take the case of Mahmoud Khalil, and there are like 5 others now, something like 5. I may have the number wrong, maybe more, maybe less. The most recent case I saw, they went after somebody at the University of Alabama, okay? Do you think the people in the Trump administration know about students in the University of Alabama who are quote unquote pro-Hamas? Do you think they know? Do you think they care? Who's supplying the names? Who is supplying the names? Who's telling the Trump administration, go after that person, go after that person, go after that person? Who's supplying the names? I know who's supplying the names. The Canary Mission, all of these these foreign agents of a genocidal state, these foreign agents of a genocidal state, they're supplying all the names. Do you really think Trump, now I know Trump doesn't like wokeness, and Mr. Vance doesn't like wokeness, and a lot of others. Do you think they care about Middle East studies departments? No. They don't know what the Middle East is. They look for it in the map of the United States, Midwest, Mideast. No, really. So why are they going after, why is Columbia's department, or it's Middle East Studies, South Asian Studies, and Africana Studies. Why did they put it under, or why did Columbia agree to put it under receivership? Yesterday they went after Harvard. Yes, the Harvard Middle Eastern Studies Department, they just got rid of the leadership. It was just, yes, they were knocked out yesterday. Yeah, who's behind that? Now, if you ask me if Trump, in the DEI, that's Trump. I know that. But that's the money. That's the money. The universities, let me just be clear. If you allow me just a parallel. In the case of the UK, United Kingdom, when Jeremy Corbin was running for office, the original attack came from the Board of Jewish Deputies in the UK, and it was clearly because of his stance on Israel. No question about that. But then when his candidacy began to look serious, the whole British ruling elite, if you look at the media, from the BBC to Sky News, from the Guardian newspaper to the tabloids, the daily tabloids, they all went after Corbyn on the allegation of anti-Semitism. That was originally the claim of the Jewish Board of Deputies, that he was an anti-Semite, or all these new recruits, and the Labour Party expanded hugely under Corbyn. I think it was something like, I don't want to get it wrong, but my memory tells me it was something like 600,000 new recruits into the party when Corbyn took over. So they said it's filled with anti-Semites and so forth. And then the whole ruling elite, they said, hey, this is a way to discredit the guy. So they all latched on to the anti-Semitism charge. The worst were places like the Guardian newspaper, just horrible. The editor of the Guardian is a woman named Kath Viner. And Kath Viner had written this play about a young woman named Rachel Corrie, who was murdered in Gaza, an American woman who was murdered in Gaza. And it became a kind of cause célèbre for a short period of time. So she's perpetually trying to prove she loves Israel, now, because she wrote the play in honor and memory of Rachel Corrie. So it was the whole British ruling establishment that latched onto, grasped the anti-Semitism issue because they thought it was a wonderful way to discredit Corbyn. So it began with the Board of Jewish Deputies, and then the whole ruling elite, the screaming headlines every day about Corbyn's an anti-Semite. What happened in the U.S. is the Trump people, they latched onto the anti-Semitism at the universities and then began to expand it and to go after DEI and eventually, you don't know where it'll go. It could, I kind of doubt it, but it could go to attacking departments in climate science or climate change, climate science. I kind of doubt it because what the Trump administration does, and I have to say, I won't call it effective because it's not particularly clever. I predicted it. I said, the moment they went after the anti-Semitism, it's obvious what's going to be next. They're going to go after the whole liberal agenda on the college campuses. Now, I agree with Rosa Luxemburg, the great Marxist revolutionary, and she said every movement, if you call it a leftist movement, one of its most important characteristics has to be the capacity for self-criticism, to look at your errors, and when you commit an error, there has to be a course correction. I say this because Trump was able to go after DEI. He was able to go after a lot of, and it's continuing. We don't know yet where it will end. It is interesting that he went after Middle East studies, South Asian, and Africana. Now, I recognize they're all part of one department because he could have separated them out. It's growing, slowly but surely. The problem is, and this is not going to be a popular thing to say, it was an easy target because they alienated so many people with the idiocy that was being taught in those departments by half-baked morons. It alienated so many people. I talked to students. What went on in these classes, there was no room for dissent. There was a party line. People were terrorized to say anything critical of the woke agenda. And so there was a ready constituency when they went after it. Now, I will not give approbation to how it's being done. It should have been done democratically by people who had the moral wherewithal to say, this is nonsense, what's being taught. This is not even being taught in any meaningful sense of the word taught, because to teach is supposed to invigorate and enliven your mind, not deaden it with slogans. So slogans hollow, intellectually contentless slogans. So it was an easy target. There's very little support except among the woke apparatchiks. There's very little support on the college campus for those programs. I talked to the students, and there was something else so hypocritical about it. If you go to, I have to be careful here because I have a job right now, and I don't want to jeopardize the job. So I'm going to speak in more generic terms because I've taught at several places. I'm an itinerant, the beggar can't be chooser category. And I don't do it for the salary because I don't get paid. I get paid next to nothing. Literally next to nothing. But if you look at the course offerings in the English departments, if you look at the course offerings in the philosophy departments, this is not English. That you have to look very hard. I'm being literal because I am a mentor to several students who I want to see succeed. And I want them to take substantive courses. You have to look very hard to find a course on Shakespeare in the English department.
It's no longer required anywhere.
Forget about, I'm talking even as a non-requirement. You have to look very hard. You have to look very hard for anything in many philosophy departments except Heidegger, Foucault, and Nietzsche. Their entire departments are just Heidegger, Foucault, and Nietzsche. And some of them will throw in Carl Schmitt. This is not philosophy. So why do I say it's hypocritical? Because where the liberal elites send their children, beginning in grade school, they're reading the classics. They're reading the classics. And then what happens? By some miracle, a person from City University gets into a top law school. And then they walk into class, and students start making references to Shakespeare and Dostoevsky and, oh yeah, and that was in Dickens. And then they start talking about, Kant, Kant's critique of pure, and then the students are totally, the ones from City College, their egos are totally shattered. And so they're just being groomed to fail. So it's so hypocritical. They are all woke for everybody else, but they're not woke for themselves. By the way, I know this is a complete tangent, but if you look at the recent affirmative action decision, the students for fair admission, students for fair admissions, the one where the court overthrew affirmative action. I found it really interesting that Gorsuch, in his concurring opinion, he mentioned the fact that all these woke people, these woke liberals, they're all for affirmative action on the principle of merit, on the principle of giving minorities a chance. So they say this levels the playing field. Affirmative action levels the playing field. But they have next to nothing to say for affirmative action for rich white people in terms of legacies. If you were consistent, you would also call for the abolition of the legacies. There's very little on that. In this recent decision, the only dissent, Sotomayor, she mentioned in passing the legacy issue. Everybody getting in because their parents, like the way Jared Kushner, that dunderhead, got into Harvard, because that year, Jared Kushner's father gave Harvard $2.5 million. That's the only reason he got in. He's a complete moron. So the hypocrisy, they're always protecting themselves. So for their students, of course they're going to read Shakespeare. When I went to public middle school, we were reading Julius Caesar in 7th grade. That was just a standard for the curriculum. We were reading Edgar Allan Poe in 7th. I remember the teacher, Miss Silverstein. I remember her. And I remember we read it in 7th and 8th grade. Already we were reading it. I'll give you an example. The other day I'm walking in the street, there's a young man, we got to talking, African-American or Caribbean-American, I can't remember right now. I said, what's your best subject in school? He was a high school sophomore. Okay. What's your best subject in school? Or junior? He said, English. I said, great. He said, I'm an AP English. I said, oh, AP English. What do you read? What books have you read? Remember, we're talking about February. The school year begins in September. He said, we haven't read any books. We haven't read any books. That's our public high schools. Is that going to happen to the liberal elite, the woke?
What were they doing instead of reading books?
I have he mentioned they read a few poems. Do you know what AP is? I'm not sure of advanced placement. It means you're supposed to be going at a very rapid pace in reading. So it was not just that the wokeness was such an easy target because so many people were alienated from the woke apparatchiks who were not very bright or ventured into fields where they knew nothing. I listened to one of your interviews with another person who started to refer.
Who was this person?
I won't say.
Okay.
Somebody will have to go through all your interviews to find a person who started to speak about Husserl's contributions to mathematics And I'm thinking to myself, what does this person know about mathematics? A little humility. So it wasn't just the incompetence, it was the hypocrisy. Because the actual students, okay, there are a handful of people who love these classes. It gives them a chance to vent. But a large number found it really oppressive. This, we used to call it, it was a phrase coined by the left in self-criticism, self-mockery, what we used to call political correctness. It was a sledgehammer to the brain. They didn't like it. So it was an easy target for Trump. One person wrote to me, one good thing from Trump, it's bye-bye DEI. I think it's regrettable. And as I said, I wish it came from within, that it should have come democratically from within the university, because I think the principle of academic freedom, there is a certain haughtiness and snootiness to it, because the basic principle of academic freedom is only we are competent to judge whether a prospective faculty or a current faculty has the competence to belong in academia. Well, that makes perfect sense for physics. Why should some legislature from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, decide who is going to be in the physics department? That doesn't make any sense. Why should any cleric decide who is going to be in the biology department? And that was the initial impetus behind academic freedom, the notion that only the members of the profession are competent to judge who should and shouldn't teach and speak. And as I said, there's an undercurrent of snootiness there, but basically it makes sense, at least in the natural sciences, it makes sense. So I do believe that principle should be upheld, it should be preserved, and it shouldn't be Mr. Trump or Mr. Vance because of personal vendettas or because it's popular. The egghead, what we used to call the eggheads or the pointy heads, it's very easy to go after them. It resonates.
One, not necessarily an objection, but a clarification that I would like to make is that ideally people within a department should be making the decisions about who to hire. But the problem is that, from my perspective, one major problem, even within the hard sciences, you see ideological convictions that have nothing to do with the subject matter pervading these decisions at every level, and not just within the department, but also the administration, which is putting their thumbs on the scales too. So you no longer have hires, promotions, etc., being made based on merit, on achievement within the field, but whether there's political and ideological conformity and whether you signal that you'll play by the rules.
I'll tell you, I wish you were that elevated. 90% of it is, okay, I don't want to say 90%, unfair. A large percentage of it is just ego, pettiness, protecting your fief, not wanting somebody who might be more talented than you into your department. It's just so, you remember the famous line by Henry Kissinger, it's probably the only true thing he ever said in his life, and he probably didn't even say, he probably stole it from one of his graduate students. The line was, in academia, the battles are so brutal because the stakes are so puny. And so much of it is pettiness and puniness. But on the other hand, we're dealing with these flawed creatures called human beings. And as the best of all, maybe it's not the best, but they're very, you know what they say about democracy?
Lots of things.
It's a terrible system except when you consider the alternatives. And there aren't many alternatives to the notion of peer review and peer decision-making. There aren't, I can't really see. Look, I'm not I did not make it in the system. So I shouldn't be defending it, okay? I never got a job. I never even came close to getting a job. And you would think that I would qualify, I would be competent for a community college in rural Alabama. But I applied, even for a semester. And you want to know what? I even offered to teach for free. So I understand politics distorting the process. I get that. The door is open. You don't have to bang it down. The door is wide open. But I don't see an alternative. I can't rationally. You read the chapters of my book in Burn That Bridge on academic freedom, and I recognize there are just a whole lot of complications when you try to practice the principles of academic freedom. I recognize that. But I don't see an alternative to it. I should add, so there's no misconstrue, not so much in misconstrue, but half-truth. The primary principles, there are three main principles of academic freedom. Number one, the peers are the best judge of your competence, so that the purpose of it is to keep political forces, economic forces, and religious forces out of academia. Originally, it was religion, because originally universities were what was called the wards of religion. And they wanted to get religion. This was beginning with the German universities in the middle of the 19th century, which basically invented the idea of the modern research university. It started in Germany. And the first force they had to contend with, if you want to pursue science, which is what the German universities were about at the beginning, in the early, mid-19th century, you have to get you have to get religion out of the university. Not that you had to be an atheist, but that couldn't be the ultimate arbiter of truth. And then in our country, the next major battles were fought over the interference of economic actors, extramural actors, because it's the beginning of the 20th century, and a response to the robber barons. The robber barons are like the billionaire class now. The robber barons at the turn of the century, they were very carefully monitoring the universities for any dissent on the unchecked pursuit of wealth. And there were a few professors, really just a handful, who sided with the emergence of the workers' movement in the United States, the union movement, and also people of the left, communists, socialists, and so forth, anarchists. So the next big battles were fought to keep the robber barons out of the university. And that's where academic freedom was born in our country. People don't know it. It was in response to the robber baron assault. A few professors, one Edward Ross at Stanford, where you are studying, he was one of the famous cases of a person who was sympathetic to the plight of the working class. And there were a couple of others, Scott Nearing, who was a well-known leftist. And that's where the AAUP, the American Association of University Professors, that's when it was founded. That's where the whole principle of academic freedom in our country was established. And then the third major battle, and they actually, their statements were very prissy, but they weren't bad. They are very proper and use a lot of it was written by people like John Dewey, who wrote a lot on academic freedom. And it's so prissy and proper, but the basic principles, I think, were right. I agree with them. I'm a person of the radical left. I was and will be till I go to my grave, unless I have some very strange epiphany, which I don't expect to be happening. But I thought, as basic principles, they're probably correct. And then the third great assault came with the political forces, namely the state, with the McCarthy era. And that battle was fought when the anti-communist, it had succeeded, it had crushed all dissent, and so they didn't need the hammer blows anymore. And so the McCarthy thing died out. Mostly not because he went after leftists, but at some point McCarthy got what Stalin once called dizziness with success. He then started to go after the army. And McCarthyism ended with what were called the Army McCarthy hearings, when he started to see communists. And, well, no, you don't do that. You can do that with people on the liberal left and so forth, but that was a bridge too far. So that's when the McCarthy era effectively died. What we're seeing now is a resumption of, but a narrow tier of the billionaire class, the Jewish supremacist billionaire class. But mostly, I think it's right wing for sure, and it has nativist aspects to it for sure. It also has, and I don't like to say it, but we have to be fair with the facts. It has that element of ressentiment, what Nietzsche called ressentiment, the resentment of the lower classes at the success of the professional managerial class. So there's a lot of resentment at the pointy heads in academia, the eggheads in academia. It's an element of ressentiment, But that too, we have to acknowledge that too is a result of the snootiness of the liberal elites, always looking down on the white working class, or what remains of the white working class. Bernie Sanders, at one point, I quote him in the Burn That Bridge book. He said at one point, we do have a problem with liberal elitism in our party. He was frank about it. And you know what? I have many, many criticisms of Mr. Sanders or Bernie. But I did get from him a basic respect for working people. A basic respect for working people. If you remember, when he was on Fox News, he treated the hosts with complete respect, not deference, but respect. And you could see they responded to it. It was very hard for them to summon up any indignation against him. The indignation against him was not on Fox, it was in MSNBC. They knew that he was coming from the right place. They didn't agree with the politics, but he was coming from the right place. So the thrust now, it has a clear nativist streak. It has a clear reactionary streak. I don't want to call it racist, but it has a clear reactionary streak for sure. And it has a clear anti-intellectual streak, the ressentiment of the poor folks who never got to college and who feel, it's not just that they didn't get to college, it's the feeling that they're always being talked down to. They're always being disrespected. It's the yahoos, the rednecks, the crackers, So it has all those elements, and they have to be fought. And there is, the xenophobic element. They're going after the foreign students because there's a xenophobic, a form of the great replacement theory. These students are taking our positions or our resources at our universities. So there is the nativist, xenophobic, anti-intellectual. There are all those components which are popular. But there was a way, in my opinion, to get around that. The way to get around that was to have presented a political program that spoke to the real, heartfelt needs of these people. You'll forgive me for, again, bringing in the Schumer book, but one of the things that struck me reading it is the things that are not there. And two things that were not there were, he talks about this explosion of anti-Semitism in the United States, the usual thing. Every few years they start with a new anti-Semitism. But amidst this alleged explosion of anti-Semitism, there was a very good chance, were it not for the Democratic Party, that a septuagenarian Jew, J.E.W. from Brooklyn, would have been president of the United States. How do you explain that if you claim there's this explosion of anti-Semitism? Bernie Sanders was en route to winning the Democratic Party primary until South Carolina. Everybody thought, until South Carolina, that he was going to sweep Super Tuesday. Bernie Sanders won every single cohort under 30, blacks, Latinos, every single breakdown they use, he won every single one under 30, if you looked at the polls for the Democratic Party. There was no doubt in my mind, I'm not saying I'm the last word in this subject, but I did follow things pretty closely. He would have gotten a slice of Trump's space, maybe 10%, maybe more. That's all he needed to win. So there's this, but why? Because people didn't give a darn that he was Jewish from Brooklyn. He spoke to them. He not only spoke to their needs, he spoke to their needs with sympathy, real sympathy. That's why he had a chance. So there was a possibility. I recognize there's a problem here. I say it every day. I look at it, there's a problem here. I know that. The assaults on the university, and believe me, I am the last person to have this awe and deference to the university system. I recognize real achievement. I have no problem with that. I recognize I'm not first rank. I'm not second rank. I doubt I'm even third or fourth rank. I doubt it. And you know what? That's life. It's the God's throw of the dice. I know I work hard, but as Edison famously said, genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. I'm at least 97% on the perspiration until my brain just dies out on me. That's not my lack of will, but my brain says, no, the wheel stopped turning. I didn't get the 1% of inspiration. Very few people do, I do recognize there's a problem with what's going on at the universities now, the terror that's being wreaked on the foreign students, and soon it will not just be foreign students, that's just a matter of time. I recognize all that, and I'm very concerned about that. On the other hand, it didn't start under Trump. Let's stop that pretense. They don't even care, the ruling elites in the Democratic Party, about certain of the assaults. If it's going after people who don't like genocide, they don't care. If it's going after the Middle East Studies Department, they don't care. What was Chuck Schumer's reaction to Mahmoud Khalil's arrest? Did you read his reaction?
Mm-mm.
He tweeted, Mahmoud Khalil was arrested. Trump should present the evidence. If there's no evidence, he should be freed. That's it. It's not about a wholesale assault on academia. It's not about students being terrorized. It's not about a reign of terror having settled on academia right now. It's just one person, he was arrested, the evidence should be presented, and if there's no evidence, the charges should be dropped. That's all he saw. That's all he saw. You know why that's all he saw? Because his donors are behind it. His class is behind the whole thing. So how could he criticize it beyond a mistaken arrest? That's all it is. Maybe there was a mistake in the arrest. So, yes, I am concerned about it, for sure. But as I said, with the caveats, it didn't start under Trump. That's just a flat-out lie. And for most of the targets thus far, the ruling elites support it because the Jewish supremacist billionaire class supports it.
There was, as usual, a lot there in your response. But I think one phrase sums it up, and that's Jewish supremacist billionaire class.
No, I don't think it sums it up. It's an aspect.
No, what I was going to say, though, is I think that maybe is the key term that you used, but what really sums it up, what lies behind that, is money and follow the money. That's what I pulled out of it.
I wouldn't say that because I do believe Trump is appealing. I don't know why he really cares because this is going to be his second term of office unless something serious happens, goes awry, and we're going to have a dynasty. Why he really cares, but it is his constituency, and the constituency for various reasons, primarily economic for sure, but also reactionary tendencies, they resonate to these issues. But I think it's primarily economic. They resonate to Trump's agenda. So that, to me, is the primary aspect. It has a constituency. And you have to be honest. You see, I'm not a liberal. I'm a radical. We hated liberals in my day. You know, Phil Oakes, the folk singer, the famous song, Love Me, I'm a Liberal. And it was mocking liberals. I'm not a liberal. But on the other hand, I have to be intellectually honest. I try, you know. So you take the case of Trump's tariffs, in particular the automobile tariff. I was struck. The head of the United Auto Workers praised it to high heaven. The head of the UAW praised Trump for that to high heaven. It means there are elements of Trumpism. It's not really an ism because he's so scatterbrained. You couldn't really call it an ism, a coherent ideology. It's this random. It's like a random wrecking ball, which is right like a broken clock. It's right twice a day. The wrecking ball actually hits the pillar once or twice a day. It has popular resonances for reasons which I think are understandable. And when I say understandable, I mean there's an element of truth to them. Not just like they're crazy, but I understand where the craziness comes from. No, there's an element of truth. The resentments of the white working class at the snootiness and haughtiness of the liberal elites. You know, Bernie Sanders said the same thing as me. I get that. And it's coming from a truthful place. So there are aspects. There are, as I said, reactionary, nativist, xenophobic, racist. I'm not going to dispute it. Okay? Facts are stubborn things, and my credo in life is don't quarrel with facts. But it's a more complicated phenomenon. And you have to have a differentiated analysis of it. I never watched television. I haven't watched it since 1970. To tell you the truth, I got rid of the TV set then and never looked back. But occasionally on YouTube, I watch at night when my mind is just gone. So I saw this MSNBC interview with Susan Rice, who was the National Security Advisor to Trump. To Obama, Barack Obama. And this was the day after that famous meeting between Trump and Zelensky. And she says, well, this is all part of the plot by Trump to weaken the United States and strengthen Russia and China. That he's in cahoots with Vladimir Putin and President Xi, to weaken the United States. And she said, and the proof is he wants to cut the military budget by 8%. I'm thinking to myself, that used to be a left issue. It was even a middle-of-the-road Democratic Party issue. Everybody knew that the military budget was fantastically inflated. I mean, it was the famous statement by Dwight D. Eisenhower, a conservative Republican, about this military-industrial complex. So you can't work with people like that. There are aspects about what Trump is saying that are true. These people are completely insane with their conspiracy theories. They actually make Trump look rational. Does anybody with any lucidity of mind possibly believe that Trump is a Manchurian candidate working for Russia and China? Can any sane person believe that? So I believe there has to be a differentiated analysis of Trump, aspects of maybe by virtue of the broken clock or the wrecking ball hitting its target every once in a while. But there are aspects which are correct. And we should not fall into the trap of a blanket embrace of the Democratic Party. There has to be an independent path carved out. And as I said, part of the independent path is to acknowledge DEI was a disaster. I'll just give you one other example, which was very striking to me. So Mr. Schumer writes this book, Anti-Semitism in America. And of course, he's a trained scholar, he's an extremely smart guy. If you're writing a book entitled Anti-Semitism in America, you have to first begin by defining what you mean by anti-Semitism, basic definition of terms. And at the end of the first chapter, he writes, anti-Semitism means hating the Jewish people and all things Jewish. Anti-Semitism just is, he puts is in italics, a portentous is. Anti-Semitism just is, has been, period, will always be, period. Well, the first thing that strikes you is very stupid definition. It's like a teenager saying, anti-Semitism is what it is, Dumb.
Very rhetorically inflated.
Well, the second part, he says, anti-Semitism means hating Jewish people and all things Jewish. So in order to be an anti-Semite, you have to hate matzah, you have to hate challah, you have to hate Nathan's French fries, you have to hate macaroons, because you have to hate all things Jewish in order to be an anti-Semite. You have to hate the Marx Brothers, you have to hate Seinfeld, you have to hate the Three Stooges, you have to hate Barbara Streisand. Well, I do hate her, but I acknowledge she's a very gifted performer. In any event, why do I bring it up? So it begins with a very stupid definition, okay? But by the end, when he's talking about calling Israel a genocidal state, calling Israel a settler colonial state, calling Zionism as racism, it's very interesting what happens. Because the whole of his argument becomes, it's anti-Semitism because Jews feel it's anti-Semitism. It's how we feel. And where the language comes from, suddenly you get to crush speech on the grounds that it makes you feel uncomfortable. Where did that come from? I'm sorry, that came from the woke culture. That's our country. They're allowed to. For many Americans, the flag is sacred. It's the flag of our country. Our Supreme Court ruled, you have the right to burn the flag. It's called expressive speech. You're making a statement by burning the flag, and therefore it's constitutionally protected. You have the right. A fellow walks into a judge. He was I can't remember what his was. He wears a t-shirt, fuck the draft. Went to court, it was protected speech. I was a young man. I was a Maoist, follower of Chairman Mao. Mao Zedong, lived like him, dare to struggle, dare to win. Okay? I'm 20, 21 years old, fresh out of college. I'm in a Maoist sect. We have a newspaper. It's called The Guardian, right? Every week, we're calling for the armed overthrow of the government. That's what we were calling for. Not peaceful transition to socialism. Forget that. That was milquetoast for us. We want armed revolt, overthrow the government. So when I sat in the office in our editorial meetings, of course, we all were concerned about agents provocateurs, FBI agents who have infiltrated our midst to try to get us to do something crazy. But none of us ever feared that advocating the overthrow of the government in and of itself was going to get us arrested. That was never even a thought. We understood in America, maybe the ruling elites are crazy, but they decide we have the right to do it. And if you read through the jurisprudence, that was a very big issue, at the beginning of the 20th century, where the anarchist communists have the right to advocate the overthrow of the government, the violent overthrow of the government. And our Supreme Court said yes. I mean, it took a long time. But eventually, that's the position that won out. So in our country, the Ku Klux Klan is legal. The Nazi Party was legal. In my day, a famous assassination was the assassination of the head of the Nazi Party. His name was George Lincoln Rockwell. We all remember it. It's one of those things you remember from your kids. The Nazi Party, one of the big cases was whether the Nazi Party had the right to march through a community of Holocaust survivors in Skokie, Illinois. Where are you from? I forgot.
Chicago.
Yeah, so you know the Skokie case. And the courts ruled in Illinois they had that right. Now, you can imagine that did not make the Holocaust survivors in Skokie, Illinois feel good. They would not feel happy about that. My mother was not happy about that. I was not happy about it at that time. I did not take the side of the ACLU. I was very angry. But that's our jurisprudence. That's our country. And then suddenly, when this woke culture set in, the criterion was no longer freedom of speech. It was feeling unsafe, uncomfortable, and unwanted. Unsafe, uncomfortable, and unwanted. Those became the criteria. How it made you feel. Well, guess what? I don't think Germans feel very good being reminded about the Nazi Holocaust. So maybe it should be banned in Germany because it makes Germans feel very bad. You don't like to be told that you shove children into ovens. That makes you feel really unhappy, unwanted, uncomfortable. So maybe we should ban teaching that. And I'll tell you another thing. There are many Catholics in our country. They don't feel comfortable hearing about terminating fetuses. They feel very uncomfortable. So should we ban any discussion of abortion? And that's the standard, the corrupting standard that's set in, so much so that in the spring, and I may have even said it in previous interviews with you, when the assaults on the college campus began under the Trump, with a Jewish supremacist billionaire class demanding it, either you crush the encampments or we're not giving you alumni contributions. It was a very straight blackmail. very in your face. And they were proud of it. They were boasting about it. When it started, I kept saying every opportunity I had, this is the most brazen, outrageous assault on academic freedom in our country's history. There's never been anything like it, toppling Ivy League presidents. It's unbelievable. That never happened during the McCarthy era. That did not happen, you know. People are, oh, I'm such a liberal. Who cares about academic freedom and all those things? Because they had lost the language. They had lost the language of free speech. The language was replaced by unwelcome, uncomfortable, and unsafe. Unwelcome, uncomfortable, and unsafe. That became the language. And it was used with a certain amount of bravado by the woke culture. And then the whole thing completely backfired. Total disaster. Because the other side didn't just have their mouths and their bodies. They had the money. And so what happened? The Hillels, the campus Jewish organizations, they tell their constituency, say you feel unsafe. Say you feel unwelcome. Say you feel uncomfortable. So the constituents of the Hillels start saying it and making up stories, confecting incidents of anti-Semitism. And then the Jewish billionaire class came into play and said, our students, the Jewish students, feel unsafe, unwanted, and uncomfortable. And unless you crush the incumbents, you're not getting our money. Total disaster. But it was a disaster waiting to happen. I said it on page 37 of my book, Burn That Bridge. And I explicitly said it with Palestinian students. I said, if you claim that you feel unsafe, uncomfortable, and unwanted when an Israeli speaker comes to campus, I said it's only a matter of time before it's going to backfire. And I said that before anything happened, long before the encampment. It was obvious what was going to happen. There's a former head of the ACLU, her name is Nadine Strassen. I don't think we agree on much, but she's an honest liberal. She'll hear me out. She read some of the things I wrote. She was generous in acknowledging me in a book that she wrote on free speech, which nobody will ever do. Nobody will ever acknowledge me in anything. Or a footnote, forget, impossible. Impossible, like uncomfortable.
In an academic publication?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think there's been this. If you were to search, my book on Gaza is the only book on political history of Gaza out there. There's one, mine, period, full stop. There's an economic history by Sarah Roy, and there's a political history by me. There has not been a single mention of it in any mainstream or even non-mainstream London Review of Books, New Left Review, no mention, none, zero.
I know this isn't why you're bringing it up.
Yeah, but I want to just complete the thought. So Nadine Strassen wrote a book on free speech, on the issue of free speech. And she mentioned that Europe, they passed all these anti-hate speech laws. All the anti-hate speech laws. And then she comments, they all backfired because guess what? They were all used against the vulnerable minorities. They were all used against the people that you thought they would protect. But power's not going to protect you. It'll protect themselves. And she was exactly right, because that's what happened now. All of the hate speech legislation was leveraged to attack the opponents of the genocide in Gaza. Complete disaster. And I knew it was going to happen. I said it. Page 37. Don't go down this route. It's going to be a catastrophe. And it happened.
What I was going to say is that I know this wasn't your point, but I can only imagine how, I mean, maybe you're numb to it at this point, but how painful it must be to have your life's work, something you care so much about, go uncited and unrecognized despite knowing the value that it holds for the scholarship?
Now I'm bemused, as Professor Chomsky used to call it, the discipline of these apparatchiks on the right, in the center, and on the left. Because there are many authors on the left, in places like the radical chic London Review of Books, which also, can I use the expression, canceled me. So now at this point in my life, I will not deny the bitterness. I will not deny the bitterness at a point in my life. But now I'm bemused. And part of the bemusement comes from the fact that through this miracle called the social media, all the efforts to wipe me out haven't succeeded in the way they once did. And even with all the algorithmic adjustments to wipe me out in the current social media, it hasn't succeeded. And I've been able to have an impact, and I'll tell you the truth, the impact for me is a burden. On the one hand, I want it. I believe that what I'm saying is true, and I believe what I'm saying is important at the current moment. There's a genocide unfolding in Gaza, so it's important. On the other hand, it means I can't be quite, what can you say, a little bit cavalier as I was in the past, because my words have consequences. I have an audience. So it's not like I'm afraid to say certain things because it will, quote unquote, get me in trouble, or it will lessen my access to some places if I say something too, quote unquote, outrageous. No, I don't fear that at all. Absolutely not. I don't never even think about it. But I think, Norm, you have to weigh your words a little more closely now, because they can actually have consequences. They're consequential. People listen to me. They don't only, with Professor Chomsky was a very, I'm not saying it in a negative way, he was a very deceptive public intellectual. You have to hear me out. There's nobody in God's earth who has a higher regard for Professor Chomsky than I do. The reason I say deceptive is because he made it seem as if all of his political conclusions flowed logically from the factual data. He was just processing, like a computer, just processing the raw data, and this is the conclusion. But that was not true at all. All the raw data was filtered through his moral judgment. Right. And so that moral filter was critical to the conclusions that he reached. You didn't see it. I never saw it. I absolutely did not see it. All I saw was, on the printed page, he presented the facts with 10,000 footnotes to document the facts, and then, quote unquote, he must be right. It was like an arithmetic example, not even an equation, just an arithmetic example. 1 + 1 + 1 + 1 + 1, you add up all the footnotes. This must be the truth, the conclusion. But no, the end product is always filtered through the moral judgment. And so now, when I say I have to weigh my words much more carefully, it's because I know that my accumulation of factual knowledge in and of itself doesn't yield the political conclusions. It does not. I then have to figure out, what do you do with all this factual knowledge? What political or moral conclusions do you draw from it? And that's, for me, a very heavy burden. I wasn't trained in it. And suddenly my judgment is being attended to. And so it's become, in a way, in an aspect. It was easier before. I could pretty much, sometimes I say wild things. Everybody does says wild things in private, And as I say, it's not the fear. I'm too old to care. I have no career ahead of me. A job in academia is long past. All my friends are retired from my age cohort. So it's not like I fear, and I still have no access. I have none. I have not been, except for Piers Morgan, who noticeably hasn't called on me in recent months. I was on no mainstream program at all. You take everyone from a Joe Rogan to a Mehdi Hassan. That whole range from Joe Rogan to Mehdi Hassan. No access at all. None. Zero. None. But if I'm in a program with you, not in that tier as of now, but if I'm in a program with you, by the end of the day, I'll get 500,000 people who will have heard it. So I'm not really, access does it. I laugh at it. I laugh at the fact, I really do, bemusement. It's not like a hearty, it's bemusement. The only person who wrote a book on Gaza, and it's been in the news for 17 months, and nobody will go near me. Nobody will debate me. At Oxford, I was supposed to debate Benny Morris. He dropped out at the last minute. He said he won't debate me unless Ehud Olmert, the former prime minister, is on. So the organizers of the debate at Oxford went to Ehud Olmert. Ehud Olmert said, I won't go on with Norman Finkelstein.
Was this after the Lex Friedman debate?
Oh, long after. It was like a year later. The Oxford thing was it was 2 months ago. Lex Friedman was about a year later, a year before, excuse me. So I've had no access. Nobody's debating me. So, and it's funny, the only book. And you could say, oh yeah, he wrote a book on Gaza, but it was University of California Press that published it. So you can't use the grounds of obscure publisher put out, or Vanity Press. No, that's not what happened. So, so I'm at this point, I keep reminding myself, I'm so harried right now by so many obligations, responsibilities, and sometimes I don't know. I'm running from pillar to post. And I say, Norm, you're going to be dead in 20 years. Calm down. Calm down. So I'm at that point in life where at most there's no longer bitterness, there's just amusement.
Speaking of being quite careful with one's words, I think now, since it's come up a number of times, it's worth getting into Chuck Schumer's book a little bit more. Something that strikes me that you paid close attention to was his definition of anti-Semitism. And I notice that it's not only words like anti-Semite, but racist, sexist, homophobe. They are thrown about with utter abandon these days. And
Fascist.
yeah, and they're rarely defined. They're used as catch-all terms, and they're extremely damaging because once you hurl that term at someone, they're on the defensive, and it's very hard to defend yourself against a claim like that. That's so all-encompassing. So what I'd like to ask then, so relevant to what we're talking about right now, is how ought we to define anti-Semitism?
I don't think we should use the term. I don't use it. First of all, and I'm not being coy here, for several thousand years, there's been a debate among Jews about what's a Jew. So if you don't know what a Jew is, how could you know what an anti-Semite is? If anti-Semite means somebody who hates Jews. If you don't know what a Jew is, why use the term, how can you know what an anti-Semite is?
This is an ongoing debate among like rabbinical scholars, or?
No, it's an ongoing debate among Jews, whether, if you don't believe in the religion, are you Jewish? If you're conservative, is the Reform wing of Judaism Jewish? And if you're Orthodox, is the conservative and the Reform? And if you're an atheist and you're Jewish, are you a Jew? And so on and so forth. There's no agreement on what's a Jew. So, by the way, Hitler had a lot of problems with that. He did because he claimed Jews were a race. Well, how do you prove the Jewish race? He had no other way except to prove it by descent from a Jewish, a self-identified Jew, a religious Jew, a descent. But he couldn't prove a Jewish race. So there was all these. It was a very complex system of, if you had three grandparents who were Jewish, and if one was married to a non-Jew, and they were called the mixture, were called the Mishlinga, the mixture of not Jew and non-Jew. He had a problem where obviously it was a fateful problem for those who were being defined as Jewish, but he couldn't define what a Jew was in his terms as a racial group, because how do you prove a racial group? So Jews haven't been able to define. I don't see any need for terminology like that. If you agree, if you commit a physical crime against somebody, then we're covered for it. Assault, murder, even harassment. So if it's a physical act, we have laws that already cover it. If it's a verbal act, what are called hate crimes, but not just a hate crime, which is you target somebody because they're Jewish, you target somebody because they're black. It's a physical targeting. So as I said, it's that aspect of assaults on Jews is already covered by the law. We don't need hate. We don't need hate crime as a specific delineation or subdivision. We just call it an assault, a mugging, a murder. It's already covered, so we don't need it. Now there is the question of verbal hate crimes. In general, I don't think we need it. I kind of think the U.S., I'm not a flag waver, as you know, but I kind of think the way the U.S. works is probably the best way. You want to say it, say it. It's the old sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never harm me. Now, I recognize I've taught it for 40 years, the issue of free speech. So I recognize the problems with that formulation, because names sometimes do harm you. It's called psychological and emotional damage. That was, John Stuart Mill, the great exponent of liberty of speech. He's totally oblivious to that. He will not accept that words can harm. Now, could you say it's because he had a naive understanding of human psychology? It was the 19th century before Facebook, or a naive understanding of one's emotional constitution? I don't think so. I think he understood that once you start going down that route, it's the end of free speech. If you start going down the route of hurt feelings as grounds for curbing speech, then free speech is over. It's dead. Because every form of speech hurts somebody's feelings, for whatever reason. If you're a sibling and your mother says to your brother or sister, "Oh, you look so beautiful today," your feeling could be hurt. Your ego is damaged, So I think he understood that once you allow for the category of emotional hurt, psychological hurt, it ends up with no free speech is over. So I kind of agree that we don't need terms like anti-Semitism or racism. First of all, because I think they're gratuitous. Secondly, because they end up stifling speech. And third of all, because they're just not intellectually illuminating. It's a speech killer. It's a mind number. It doesn't allow for any genuine intellectual exploration. And there, I have to say, I kind of agreed with the Supreme Court. When the Supreme Court had to ask this very simple question, how can you support the right of communists and anarchists to overthrow the government? This is they believed it was a democratically elected government. And so their answer, I was puzzled by that. How could, in my parlance, how could a bourgeois institution allow for speech advocating its overthrow? And that was a conundrum for me. How could that be? That doesn't make any sense. They're allowing for speech which encourages the overthrow of the government. In my view, monopoly capitalist government. How could that be? And then when you read through the reasoning was quite interesting. The reasoning was because even if we disagree with overthrowing our government, there are critiques there of the capitalist system, of policy, and so forth, which might be valuable. There might be something valuable buried in their rhetorical, not flourishes, but their hateful rhetoric. There might be something valuable buried there, which they said truth would miss out on if they were silenced. And by the way, by far, the greatest scholar of the Nazi Holocaust was Raoul Hilberg. And he was once asked the question of Holocaust deniers. What should you do with them? And his answer was very interesting. Hilberg was old-fashioned. He understood knowledge. He said, quote, "Let them speak." Because we have built this intellectual edifice on the assumption, the premise, not just premise, on the foundation, the solid scholarly foundation that the Nazi Holocaust happened. he actually built the foundation himself. He was the first, and everything pretty much came off of him, was built off of him. But he said, now that we're at the third, fourth, and fifth, sixth, and seventh story of our edifice, he said there may be some errors in our foundation. It doesn't mean everything is wrong. As Raoul Berg famously said, the Nazi Holocaust happened, but proving it happened, it's not so easy. Proving it happened, it's not so easy. And he said, we may have some errors in our foundational premises, not that the whole foundation is wrong, and not as if the foundation is about to crack and the whole edifice will come tumbling down. But there may be an error here, there may be an error there, so let them speak. And I feel the same way. All right, maybe the person is an anti-Semite, and I'll tell you the truth. I get a lot of emails from anti-Semites. I don't like them. And I'll admit, sometimes I betray my principles and I just delete. But then they sometimes make points. I'm not saying I necessarily agree with them, but they do cause me to think and how to answer them. And it's a mentally arduous task. So I don't see how attaching the label racist, misogynist, transphobe, attaching the label, it doesn't facilitate, it doesn't abet the thinking process. It stops it dead in its tracks. And if you believe in intellectual mental labor, then you cannot pursue it. You cannot pursue it if people hurl these epithets at you designed to kill the conversation. That was one of the things I very much liked about W.E.B Du Bois when I read him, the great African-American scholar. I wrote a lot about him in the book, the Burn That Bridge book, because he was living in a very racist era, okay? He was born the end of the 19th century, into the and he's doing his major work from the beginning to the middle of the 20th century, the beginning to the middle. And he was in a very uncomfortable climate. And it was very interesting to watch him. I mean that. It touched me. He patiently parses every argument against the equality of African Americans and so forth. He concedes a lot of ground. He'll say a lot of the criticism of Negro life, as it was called back then, a lot of criticism is valid. He will concede that. He will still say the main issue is economic opportunity. African Americans aren't giving the opportunity, but he patiently parses. And the other thing which struck me, these are personal observations, which is why a book is rich. It stimulates different personal observations in different people. So the universities to study when he was a student in the late 19th century, the places to go were Germany, the great research universities. And he goes to study in Germany. He studied at Harvard, but Harvard's kind of a backwater, doesn't produce anyone of great stature in that era. He goes to study in Germany, and he studies under the great German historian, von Treitschke. And he's sitting in von Treitschke's class, and Treitschke, the fiery, German intellectual, and at one point he blurts out in German, I can't I was saying in English, the Negroes are inferior. The Negroes are inferior. They know they are inferior. And Du Bois calmly writes, he says, I don't think he was directing that at me personally. He probably didn't even notice me. It was a huge lecture hall, you know? And then he says, Treitschke was my best professor, the most interesting of my professors. When I was in college, I had a professor, Morris Watnick, the most misanthropic right-winger you can ever imagine. He just had contempt and disgust at ordinary mortals. Brilliant guy. But I'll tell you, so I'm this Maoist, completely crazed. I admit, I think my sentiments were positive. I don't think I was all wrong, by the way. I would go to his class, hang on to every word. Hang on to every word. He talked very slow, lapidary phraseology, like the facets of a diamond, lapidary phraseology. So you could take it in. You had time to process it. And I knew he was smart. And then I would walk out, meet with my friends in the cafeteria. Watnick said this about Marxism. Watnick said that about Marxism. What's the answer? How do you answer that? We had to read this book called, I still remember it. I even remember the author, John Plamenot's Marxism and the Russian Revolution. I still remember it. My point, I could have called him a bourgeois intellectual. I could have just dismissed it all. In another era, he's a racist, he's a racist, he's a male chauvinist or a misogynist. We don't say MCP anymore. In my day, it was MCP, male chauvinist pig. But now it's misogynist. He's a transphobe. I could have done that. And you know what? If I did, I would have been an idiot. My biggest regret to this day, I didn't take more courses with him. You don't know how much I regret that. He was a very hard grader, so I was a little afraid it would damage my GPA, but which I'm not proud to admit. That was a consideration. I regret not taking more courses from him. So you fling these labels, and the labels are fundamentally, they're anti-thought. They're anti-thought. So I don't see the need for them. The practical, Mill's distinction, chapters 1 and 2, liberty of speech, chapters 3 to 5, liberty of conduct. And there are many big restrictions on liberty of conduct. You can advocate nudity, but you can hand out leaflets saying nudity is great, but you can't come to class nude. There's a distinction between speech and conduct. And when it comes to the speech, I see no need for it. And even if you wanted a category for hate crimes, verbal hate crimes, even if you wanted a category, then you just use categories for hate speech against any group of people. So you have hate speech. You don't need a separate category for anti-Semitic hate speech. Just if it's hate speech and you want to curb hate speech because of the emotional and psychological damage potentially it can cause, I don't agree with that, but I can acknowledge people's differences of opinion on that, but I don't think you need a category. I don't think they help. They're not useful in trying to understand the phenomenon. Now, if somebody systematically targets a group, be it African Americans, be it Jews, be it immigrants, so then you want to say the person is systematically targeting that group, of course. We're not going to pretend it's some generic category of people who are being targeted. This is a particular group. But as a political category, I don't see the I watched your face, and I referred to Du Bois in a very racist climate, and you think to myself, oh, but he just used the word racist. Sometimes I might slip. I'll acknowledge that. But in general, I just don't use the term because I think it just stifles thought. It doesn't get us anywhere when we are trying to understand a phenomenon. That's why I kind of really warmed. I was very surprised, but I really warmed to Du Bois. Du Bois made only one exception to freedom of speech, and he was very upfront about it because he recognized it was a violation of his principles. There was a famous film in our country called Birth of a Nation. It was the first cinematic spectacle. They used music. It was the first time I think music was used in a cinematic undertaking. And it was hugely popular. And it was hugely anti-Black. And it was the one time in Du Bois's career he called for censorship. His reasoning was there was an uptick in lynchings every time that film was shown. And his second reasoning was we just didn't have the resources to combat it at a cinematic level. Black people cannot mount a cinematic spectacle to counter Birth of a Nation. I mention it, I've actually, used it in class assignments. I would say when we do free speech, or when we do the issue of free, do you agree with Du Bois's reasoning? I was surprised most did not. Most students did not accept it, that these are grounds for censorship. But be that as it may, it was the one exception. He recognized it's an exception to my rule. There were at that point all the eugenicists when Du Bois is writing. They're all the eugenicists, the race science people. Black people are intellectually inferior on this ground, that ground, that ground. And he just sat down and he just very patiently parsed the evidence. He reached the conclusion, I don't think it's correct. Some of his observations really struck me, I have to say. He said there's no clear-cut categories of what is Black. He says each category just shades off into another category. So how do you know when you're making these arguments if the person is Black? And then I began to ask myself the question, how do you know when a person takes an IQ test, how do you know if the person is Black or white? How do you know it? And it's all self-identification as far as I've understood from talking to people about it. I've not researched it on my own. So it's a person saying I'm Black or white that's being measured. Whether a person actually is. There was there was a radical in the 60s. His name was Stokely Carmichael. He eventually came by the name of Kwame Ture. It was either I think it was Stokely Carmichael, who's a smart guy, but I didn't like his politics at all at the end, off the wall. He was one of the heads of SNCC, the Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and he eventually, I don't agree with his politics. I'm not going to make a big deal about it. And he said, well, maybe black people are genetically inferior because of all those crackers who raped us. Maybe it's their genes that have caused our IQ to drop. That was an interesting argument. In any case, I don't know the science of it, obviously. I don't. There was a very good article in by a top, his name I can't remember, a top neuroscientist. It was in the magazine called Cognitions. Do you know it?
No.
It's a top tier in neuroscience. And it was when the bell curve came out by Herrnstein and
Charles Murray.
And he wrote a very interesting article. And he said in the article that there is like 80%, I'm using the numbers, I don't know, 85% of IQ is genetic, 15% is environmental. And he said, well, if that's correct, then it may be because the differential between black and black and white, whatever those categories mean, I don't know. I'm not saying they have no content. I'm just saying I don't know. The differential is less than 15%. He said it may be that black people are smarter than white people. If the environmental factor is 15%, it's possible that it's just the reverse of what's normally. Anyhow, it was for me an interesting argument. I don't know the answer. I know Professor Chomsky recommended I read that article. It was very, very smart. For those of you who are listening, just Google Cognitions, the bell curve review, and you should be able to find it. In any event, the point is, they weren't afraid. You see, most of the labeling is fear. You don't understand that? They're afraid that the other side might be right, so they don't want it to be discussed. It's at core, at heart, it's fear. That's why Mr. Schumer says settler colonialism, anti-Semitic. Saying what Israel is doing in Gaza, anti-Semitic. Saying Zionism is racism, anti-Semitic. Why does he do that? Because he doesn't want there to be any discussion of it. He's afraid of what what Mills called full, fearless, and frequent discussion might reveal. Those who are confident of their beliefs, Raoul Hilberg, let Holocaust deniers speak. Raoul Hilberg had lodged in his brain the whole 500 volumes of the Nuremberg trials. People were terrified of his accumulation of knowledge. My close friend at the time, Ruth Bettina Byrne, she's a first-rate Holocaust historian, first-rate. She said to me, the first time I was going to meet him, I was so afraid because I thought his skull must be massive. The amount of information he had stored away. So he wasn't afraid of a Holocaust denier. He knew, he was confident that he could withstand any assault on his beliefs. Du Bois was very confident of his beliefs in the equality of African Americans. So he just patiently parsed the evidence and always said at the end, maybe new information will come along and I might be wrong. Always open to the possibility that the future may reveal new evidence and I might be wrong, And so at heart, this labeling is not because they say they shouldn't be allowed to lie. Okay? If it really were just an outright lie, that would be very simple. What do? You expose the lie. So people say there were no gas chambers at Auschwitz, and that's Holocaust denial. Okay? Well, there's a very easy way to answer that. Present your evidence that there were gas chambers. Why do you have to stifle that person from saying it? Just present the evidence. So they say if you say Jews, 6 million Jews didn't die during the Nazi Holocaust, or you say they died of diphtheria and various diseases, okay, then just present the evidence. Why do you have to take this sledgehammer? Because people are afraid. They're afraid they can't answer. And now Israel has a real problem. A Holocaust, a genocide unfolding in real time on the social media, real problem, big problem. So we have to suppress it. We have to suppress it. That's their real goal. And that's, in my opinion, what's behind all those labels. It's the fear of an open debate where, you know what? As the great Raoul Hilberg put it, the Nazi Holocaust happened, not so easy to prove it. And you know what? That's true of a lot of things. Not so easy to prove. Not so easy to prove. It takes work. This book gave me a royal headache. If you look, it's just filled with scribbles, every single page. You just go crazy. Yeah. Every single page. The lies, the lies, the lies, the lies, the lies, the lies. And I keep thinking, am I going to sit down and answer this? Am I going to answer everything in this book? And I'm so tired. I'm so exhausted. But I feel I have to answer. And you know what? It's not so easy. So there is the fear element, and there's the fact that people don't want to do the work. It's so much easier to just hurl an epithet and end the discussion. I told him I really put him in this place. I called him a racist. No, you didn't put him in place. You didn't put anyone in their place by calling them. I called him an anti-Semite. They think they'll silence me by calling me an anti-Semite or a self-hating Jew. No, you didn't do anything. You did nothing. It's a zero, intellectually, mentally. It's a zero. So, I don't think we need the epithets. I don't think we need them, and I think they're positively harmful. Because the moment you suppress speech, people are wondering, why are they trying to suppress that speech? Maybe there's something there. The biggest boon to Holocaust deniers is to turn them into martyrs. Because then everyone assumes there must be something there. That's why they're being silenced.
Let me play devil's advocate for a position that I don't think is entirely ludicrous, and it can be read out of Chuck Schumer's book. And you said that labels are anti-thought, these labels like anti-Semite. But thought, it started as thought, then it turned into speech, and then it turned into the Holocaust in Germany. And I don't need to tell you, you know better than anybody who did not survive the Holocaust themselves, the cost of the Holocaust. So For this reason, it seems even if one does not want to stifle the speech, even though you might find the labels inherently stifling, there should be some way to take the temperature of speech or sentiment in order to be aware and perhaps be vigilant against something like that happening again.
Well, the question is how to be vigilant. Mill already pointed out on Liberty. He said unwelcome ideas, given mass communication, they always find a way of making their way through. You can't suppress them. And then he says the problem is that once they make their way through, if you haven't addressed them, you have no intellectual defense against them. They just start spreading with such ease. So, as I said, he's writing in the 19th century. In the 20th century, or 21st century, with the advent of the internet, you can't suppress these ideas. There's no way, there's no possibility that you could suppress them. So then what's the only thing you can do? Try to answer them. Try to convincingly answer them. Now, there are some people who won't be persuaded, I know that. But, it's a wager of people who believe in rational thought that large numbers of people will be responsive to a reasoned argument if you can demonstrate your point of view. And for the rest, it makes no difference if you suppress it or not, because they're going to find it, they're going to hear it anyway, and they'll run with it. So I don't. If you were of a Millian disposition, by the way, he was anything but a radical, very staid Victorian. No, he had this eccentric side. So, in Germany, I think, I don't know what's the law right now, but for the longest time, it was illegal to publish Mein Kampf, okay? If you're a Millian, if you're really concerned about the resurgence of Nazism, then you should be studying Mein Kampf in grade school, going through it line by line and trying to show why what it's saying is wrong. That's how you prevent it happening again. At least one level of preventing it happening. And obviously, there has to be organization, and there also has to be an answer to problems which are plaguing a society. If you look at the history of Nazism in Germany, and we have it exactly because we have the polling results, the election results. The Nazis were polling 2-3% of the population. And you know where it took off? We know exactly. You can see 1929. It wasn't anti-Semitism. It was the collapse of the economy. Then it went right into 18%. It leapt from like 2 or 3 to 18%. So you don't want to create the conditions in which these sorts of ugly phenomena can gain traction. So that's the first thing you have to do. There is a lot of ugliness in our society now. I don't doubt that. Well, because there's a lot of anger and discontent out there right now. People are really hurting. And in that kind of climate, scapegoats, it's the immigrants, they're taking all our jobs, So in my opinion, if you're really concerned, and at this point, I kind of agree with Schumer. I thought some of the things he said, broken clock is right twice a day. Is there a danger of a resurgence here of anti-Semitism here? Yes, there is. It is a historical scapegoat. And Jews have a lot of power. They have a lot of money. And they're a tiny minority. And that's a target. I recognize that. I'm not going to deny those facts. But for the moment, the main targets, we know they're immigrants. I mean, they're very out front about who are the scapegoats right now. They are immigrants. They are sexual minorities. Those are the current scapegoats. At some point, yes, it's possible. And then how do you address it? I think that the way you address that problem is, first of all, I think Bernie Sanders was right. The first way you address it is by trying to address the real hurt and pain that people are feeling right now in our society. And secondly, I think we have to be truthful to the facts. We have to be honest, and hopefully you can persuade. I think Bernie Sanders was able to persuade during his electoral campaign. I don't believe the answer is censorship. Now, there are all these claims about, well, the web has accelerated the dissemination of knowledge to such a, it's now like instantaneous that people are getting this knowledge, and so the crimes, the likelihood of the crimes. Well, obviously, I'm not a tech person, you know that, but I recognize some aspects are true. But you know what? The radio was able to send messages very quickly also. The radio was not exactly slow in communicating a message to kill. It wasn't exactly slow-moving either. I detest the current obsession with the iPhone. It fills me with nausea. Nausea, really. I had it out with one student the other day. No, I did.
I feel bad for him.
I prohibit that stuff in my class, but the students are so addicted, they cannot let go, cannot let go. In any event, but I have to be honest to the facts. You know, in my day, an average American, you'll find this hard to believe. Go back and look at the numbers. You should when we get off. An average American was in front of the television for about 6 hours a day. That was the average, 6 hours. Now, you're how could that be? Yeah, it's very strange. I used to figure out, well, there are 24 hours in the day. You sleep for 8 hours. You're at work for 8 hours. That's 16 hours. That's only 8 hours left. And 6 hours watching television. So the fixation on the media, now it's the social media. And it wasn't exactly elevated intellectual fare, F-A-R-E, on the television set. We called it back in my day. It was called the boob tube. So obviously things have changed, but the job of the historian is always to look at continuity and change. It's not something totally new. So I don't personally believe that the rapidity of the dissemination of knowledge or dissemination of words, I don't believe it's of such a qualitatively different level or degree that it requires new laws, you know. It's very funny to read Schumer's book. He says one of the reasons that there's anti-Semitism is because of people are siloed in their own universes. You know, everybody has found their little niche on the universe, in the web, okay? And he says, you know, in our day, things were so much better. People weren't siloed. Now, his answer was very revealing. He said, and it's absolutely true, absolutely true. He said, everybody got their news from ABC, NBC, or CBS. ABC, NBC, CBS. Channel 2, CBS. Channel 4, NBC. Channel 7, ABC. I know it like yesterday. We all got our news. We even knew, everybody knew the name of the news, what they were called news anchors. Channel 2 was Walter Cronkite, CBS. Channel 4 was Huntley and Brinkley, NBC. 7-day varied over time. And he said, we all got the news from those 3 stations. The same stories, the same news stories were on all 3 stations. And you know what? If you flip the dial, because I remember very well, if you flip the dial, the second, not the first, the second news story on CBS was the second news story on NBC, the second news story on ABC. All 3, not just the top story, the top news, the second story, the third story. And he said, and then at the water cooler, he would say at work, each morning after the news, he said, we would all be discussing the same news. And why did that make me laugh? Because that was a completely totalitarian society. We were watching exactly the same news. We were told we had choices. You can watch Walter Cronkite or Huntley and Brinkley or ABC. But we weren't choosing in any meaningful sense. It was all the same news. Same thing with the newspapers. The New York Times was the pace setter. And then the second-tier newspapers, they couldn't afford the foreign reporters of the Times or the investigative journalism of the Times. So they took all their stories from the Times. So I'm not saying the siloing is great. No, there's a problem there. The echo chamber of your own little silo. But I don't think the totalitarian model was particularly great either. And that's how he describes it. He thinks that's the preferable model, where we all get the same news under this pretense of choice, ABC, NBC, or CBS. So, to return after a long digression to your question, yes, of course you have to be seriously concerned about the resurgence of lethal forms of hate. Of course you have to be concerned about that resurgence. The question is, how do you fight it? And I think fundamentally, the first way to fight it is make a society in which some 80% of our society is not hurting. 80% of our society doesn't see any future. 80% of our society is susceptible to scapegoating because of that anger and bitterness. And the second thing is to deal honestly with the facts. If you believe that, if you're a person of the left, you believe that truth and justice go hand in hand, that you can believe in the just world and believe that truth is not contrary to it. So I am of that belief. I'm not afraid of truth. I'm not claiming I have a monopoly on it, but I am claiming I'm not going to run from it. I will work very hard to find flaws in your reasoning if something you say I find detestable. But I have to find the flaws. I have to do the hard work. I am long past that period in my life when I dismiss everything I don't like as being bourgeois propaganda. That's not a satisfactory response. So I believe that truth is on the side of justice, so I'm not afraid of the truth. And if something turns up not to be on the side of justice as I understand it, I have to contend with it. But in my opinion, what you describe correctly as people claiming that they're just suppressing this speech because of its future repercussions, possible future repercussions, I think 90% of it is fear that what's being said is true and trying to suppress it, to nip it in the bud. They weren't attacking the encampments because they were anti-Semitic. That is so ridiculous. I went to the encampments. I saw the young people. I was in constant communication with them. They weren't suppressing it. Mr. Schumer wasn't in cahoots to crush them because he was afraid of a resurgence of anti-Semitism that might climax in a Holocaust. That's not what was going on. It's because his holy state was being exposed as a genocidal regime. That's what was irking them, because these Jewish billionaire supremacists demand the right to commit genocide. That's at heart what's going on. If you believe that the charge of genocide is anti-Semitic, that would make Amnesty International anti-Semitic because it published the 250-page research document saying Israel was committing genocide. That would mean Human Rights Watch is anti-Semitic because it published a report saying that Israel was committing genocidal acts in Gaza. That would mean that virtually every judge on the International Court of Justice, including the American judge, Joan Donoghue, must be anti-Semitic because they said Israel was plausibly committing genocide in Gaza. That would mean a large number of Jewish Holocaust historians are anti-Semitic because they say that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. Is that believable? Is that believable that these are all closet anti-Semites? Is that plausible? That's not why he's trying to suppress it. The use of the term "or the encampments" is because he doesn't like what it reveals about his quote-unquote people, quote-unquote. That's it. It's just pure Jewish supremacy. I never use the word Zionism. I think Zionism is an utterly useless term, though two people agree on what it means. I'm agreeing with the Israeli human rights organization, B'Tselem. It's a decent organization. It didn't rise to the challenge of October 7th, but I'll give them a pass on that. It was very hard to be in Israel and rise to the challenge of how to handle what happened October 7th and thereafter. But they said, now already maybe 5 or 7 years ago, they said there's one state between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. There's no occupied West Bank anymore. There's no occupied Gaza. It's just one state. And they said the state is built on the principle, the foundation of the state is Jewish supremacy. I think that's an accurate description. No stupid terminology like Zionism. Calling somebody a Zionist is just flinging another epithet totally. I'm called by parts of the Solidarity movement a liberal Zionist. It's just stupid. To dismiss me because I have my own criticisms of some aspects of the Palestine Solidarity movement. It's a totally useless term, but Jewish supremacy is not bad. It accurately captures a reality like South Africa was a white supremacist state. I think it captures a reality, a concrete, a palpable reality. More value is attached to a white life than a non-white life. If you describe the American South as white supremacist before the Civil Rights Movement, it captures a reality. White life was, more value was attached to a white life than a non-white life. And in the current moment, these are Jewish supremacists. They demand the right to commit genocide. That's their ultimate demand. And anybody who denies them that right to commit genocide in Gaza, they have to be crushed. They know the facts. These are literate people. If you're using starvation as a method of war, everybody agrees on that. Israel, even Chuck Schumer will acknowledge that, more or less. No, he'll acknowledge that the far right advocates using starvation as a method of war. He won't acknowledge that's the whole of Israeli society. If you deprive people of water, that's what the Human Rights Watch report was on. Israel is systematically denying water to Gaza. A very comprehensive report, boring to tears. Boring to tears, because Human Rights Watch recognizes if you're going to make the charge of genocide against Israel in the United States, and Human Rights Watch is very mainstream, Democratic Party adjunct, basically, you better be able to back it up. Better be able to back it up. So a very long, tedious, boring report, whether they conclude Israel is systematically denying water to Gaza, okay? You deny food, you deny water, you deny fuel, there go the hospitals, and you deny electricity. There goes everything else. It's a formula for genocide. It's not complicated. No, I agree. It's easy enough to say, but then to prove it. But guess what? They prove it. They do the legwork. They prove it. And that's what has to be silenced. Not the anti-Semitism, completely ridiculous. I was listening to an interview the other night with Bruce Robbins, who teaches English literature. And he's Jewish at Columbia University. Oh, anti-Semitism. On Columbia campus. That's ridiculous. So I agree. These are things we have to be concerned about, and I'm not oblivious. He makes the point, Schumer, which is true. I've thought about it. There's not an original thought in this book. It's thoughtless. It's like what Hannah Arendt described as the banality of evil. She said evil is not like a satanic concept. You discover that evil is thoughtless. It lacks thought. That's his little book. It's completely thoughtless. But some things he says. He said, look, Jews were very comfortable in Germany before the rise of Hitler. And it was considered Germany was a haven for Jews. And that can snap overnight. That can, flip overnight. Yeah, I agree with that. I've thought about that. I'm not going to deny that. So we have to be sensitive, especially, I think, Jews in the U.S., because they're a tiny minority, but they're very rich and very powerful, and that makes a lot of enemies and makes you an easy target. That's a fact. So far, no. So far, because Jews are very well entrenched in the ruling elite. Bill Clinton, his wife, Bill Clinton, Hillary Clinton, the apple of their eye, Chelsea, their daughter, she marries a Jew. Mary Tyler Moore, in my era, America's Sweetheart. She had a TV program, The Mary Tyler Moore Show. A very sweet, glamorous character. She marries a Jewish doctor. Joe Biden, 3 children. All 3 girls marry Jews. Who is the apple of Trump's eye? His daughter. Who does she marry? A Jew. Okay, so Jews are very well entrenched in the ruling elite. And I can give you 10,000 other examples, Seinfeld, all of these national icons, all Jewish, okay? So because they're so entrenched, it's an unlikely target now. Right now, the targets are easy targets, immigrants, utterly defenseless people, very hardworking, defense, no political power at all. So, and even the Hispanics, a large number of Hispanics vote for Trump, even though he's targeting immigrants from Latin America. Not much solidarity there, I might note. So right now they're not on the firing line, but it could happen. I recognize that, and I'm not. When there are places there where I wrote in the margin, agreed. I'm not afraid to say that. Agreed. He says when the use of the word Zionist now, so they say, that's a Zionist store. They mean true. And I don't like it. And I say it, I don't like it. I don't like that usage, that Zionist has replaced Jew. Those parts I agree with. I have no problem saying that. But the general picture is just complete fraud. I mean, the whole book is mythical, except about himself. On every other page, he says how great he is. And you know what? He went to my high school. He had a reputation. He was several years ahead of me. Smart guy. Achievements, impressive. I never, ever, ever belittle achievement. He was the son of an exterminator. That's a fact. He'll tell it to you on every other page in the book.
A literal exterminator.
Yes. That's one reason why exterminating the people in Gaza doesn't particularly shock him. But yes, he was exterminated, like roaches, rats, and so forth. He was the son of an exterminator. I remember his sister, brilliant girl, brilliant. And she stayed with me in my mind's eye, dressed very simply, drably, you might say, very impressive. So I don't gainsay that, but the book is thoughtless. It's just one cliche after another. One cliche after another. And so poorly written. Surprised me. I was surprised at the flatness of the prose. But I say, there are parts where I say, yeah, that's true. I'm not going to deny it. As I said, the fact that we're not so far from Germany in the Weimar era. There's Jews, not so far. Jews were 1% of German population. There were 60 million Jews in Germany and 60 million Germans, and 1% were Jewish. So the tiny minority. You read in Hitler's Mein Kampf, there was a lot of anger at the Jewish critics, in the publishing and in the artistic world, because he said they played favorites with other Jews, which is probably true. It's probably true. So those things, I can't say they made me think, because I thought about that since like age 15. So we're not talking about something new. But it's interspersed with things I nodded my head. Some of it is, I would say about 50% is pure mythology, pure mythical. He said, we used to sit around the table talking about the Holocaust. What are you talking about? That's just complete nonsense. It did strike me the book was thoughtless and so flat. But there are challenges ahead. I recognize that, and as I said, and we'll leave it at that. I think has to be as Rosa Luxemburg said there has to be ruthless self-criticism. A lot of it, the woke lunacy and the retreat from the principles of free speech, the snooty, haughty looking down on the white working class, all of those things, and I can make a much longer list, pave the way to the mess we're in right now.
So I'd like to turn away from Chuck Schumer's book and to your book, Gaza's Gravediggers, an inquiry into corruption in high places. And as I was reading through it, I mean, the first thing, naturally because of its location, what jumped out at me was the epigraph. For the fifth labor, Eurystheus ordered Hercules to clean up King Augeas's stables. Why did you choose that as the epigraph?
Well, there's an expression in English we took from that about clearing the Augean stables, where there's a very large accumulation of manure. And I would say the book is narrowly focused and maybe focused in the wrong place, because I'm looking at various international political and legal bodies, which in my opinion have been corrupted by either bribery or blackmail or careerism, various kinds of corruption. And you might say, well, Norman, why are you looking at that? You should be looking at Biden, and you should be looking at Blinken, and you should be looking at Netanyahu and his cohorts. Why are you focusing on these legal bodies? In my view, I agree they're secondary, but first of all, it takes a certain amount of mental, let's just call it, I don't want to call it discipline, mental exertion to go through all of these documents and try to prove that there is significant corruption at play. And I have that kind of discipline and willingness to expend the mental energy to going through the record. It also makes me very angry. It makes me very angry at the lies. You know, Blinken lies. Oh, that's not exactly earth-shattering revelation. Biden wasn't lying because he just didn't possess the mental competence to know truth versus a truth versus an untruth. He was in a period of serious senility. But the younger folks, they knew, Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor. But that's not really states lie. We know that, okay? But when you have international bodies, including UN bodies, where I think significant corruption and careerism, and we have another C, corruption, careerism, and cowardice are at play. It's more of a challenge. So I decided to take the challenge. It's also kind of, I know it's going to sound strange to you, it's kind of like a puzzle. How did these bodies reach conclusions which are clearly not true? I doubt you got to the 4th chapter on Joan Donoghue, but I quote the epigraph of that chapter was a quote by Montesquieu. And he says, I like peasants and farmers much more than intellectuals, something like intellectuals. He said, because they're not capable of sophisticated lies. And there's some truth to that. You meet ordinary people, they don't have the wherewithal to conjure these very complex, sophisticated lies. When you read Joan Donahue, she said, well, she was the American president of the ICJ, of the International Court of Justice, during the genocide case. And she said, we never concluded that Israel was plausibly committing genocide. And then she gives this very convoluted explanation. It's Greek or compounded by Chinese. And I go, what are you talking about? But to sit down and prove she's lying, it required 25 pages of dense prose. When Judge Sabatindi said that Israel was not committing genocide, she's the vice president of the court. She currently is vice president. She's from Uganda. It took me 60 pages to prove it. It's a lot of work. But for me, it's an intellectual enigma. How did they prove that? What argument did they make there? And then trying to take it all apart. So that's what I decided to do. I was a little reluctant with that epigraph to the book because I said, is that making me out to be Hercules? And maybe there's an element of self-aggrandizement and grandeur in making that claim. But I went with it anyway.
The book begins with a sentence, or one of the first few sentences, pairs of sentences. The 7th of October, 2023 didn't change everything, but it did change a lot. What are the big things that changed and are still changing today?
I've said it before, and you'll forgive me for repeating myself. Up until October 7th, Israel was accepting of periodically mowing the lawn in Gaza. So you have these periodic killing sprees, high-tech killing sprees. That's what they were. They were high-tech killing sprees. In Operation Cast Lead 2008-9, they killed 350 children, destroyed 6,000 homes. Operation Protective Edge, they killed 550 children, destroyed 18,000 homes. And Israel was content with that way of containing the Gaza problem. After October 7th, it was time for something else. It was to liquidate the Gaza problem. But there was not as if, for example, this is the first time Israel targeted children. No. First time it targeted hospitals. No. Anybody who's familiar with the history will know, the expression, nothing new under the sun. It was carried to a new level, for sure. It's not 6,000 homes. It's not 18,000 homes. It's 300,000 homes. It's not 350 children. It's not 550 children. It's about, at this point, about 15 or more thousand children. It's on a totally different level. At some point, quantity turns into quality. It becomes something qualitatively new. But it's not as if there weren't precedents for what Israel has done to Gaza, but at a new level.
Then going forward now, Gaza was already reduced to rubble. What do you expect to happen?
I think they're going to break the will of the people of Gaza, and by hook or by crook, they'll leave. I could be wrong. I always say that because people call me, the bearer of bad news. And I don't like to be a bearer of bad news. On the other hand, I like to treat adults like adults. If these are the facts, if they're the facts, then I am not more capable than you of living with the truth, of living, assuming it's true. I'm not more capable than you of living with the truth, so I refuse to condescend. I'm not going to patronize, like we, meaning the elite, we can handle the truth, but they can't. I'm not doing that. That's how I see the picture. I could be wrong, and God only knows I wish I were wrong. But I don't believe in this kind of elevation of the people of Gaza. They have the superhuman strength and superhuman will, and they're somehow a species apart from everybody else. No, at the end of the day, they're human beings. Now, it's true the Vietnamese did hold out. They did hold out against the U.S. near genocidal war in Vietnam. And it was always, I once asked Professor Chomsky a question. So how do you think they were able to hold out? Because they began with the French, in the early 50s, right after World War II, when they began the bulk of the struggle. And then the French were immediately taken over by the Americans. The Americans replaced them. And it didn't end really until 1975. So we're talking about 25 years. And there was a point by 1969 when the U.S. was dropping the equivalent of 2 atomic bombs in Vietnam a month. So it was a source of perplexity how they managed to hold out. I once asked the Vietnamese, hire a person in what was called the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam. I asked that question. I was curious. And he said it was the party, the political party. They were so tough. And maybe that's the explanation. I don't know, but I don't think it exists in Gaza, that kind. Now, there is a determination born of having been 70% of Gaza is refugees from when Israel expelled them in 1948. By the way, just as a footnote, the word Palestinians does not appear in Charles Schumer, Senator Schumer's book, until page 206. The book ends at page 220. The fact that Palestinians were expelled in 1948, it doesn't come up until page 206. You know, it's like the play Hamlet without the Prince of Denmark, just completely effaced. So to return to the point, yes, there is a real will among the people of Gaza. They've withstood so much. They've withstood expulsion from their homes, living in a concentration camp from the early 50s as it was described back then, when it was under Egyptian control, before it came under Israeli control, living in this concentration camp. Then on top of the concentration camp began in 2006 the siege of Gaza, this medieval siege blocking anyone and anything from going in and out, keeping people on a starvation plus diet. Then the periodic killing sprees, the Israeli mowings of the lawn. So they've built the inner wherewithal. And it's been a problem for Israel. That's why I said at the very beginning, they think that, for our interview, they believe, the Israelis believe they can eventually break the will. And I think they can. Because people in Gaza, yes, they have a lot of wherewithal, moral wherewithal, but at the end of the day, they're human beings. They've come out from, so to speak, the tunnels, even though there were no tunnels, but they were so confined. And, you know, when you're in a war, you're running. And I once asked Professor Hilberg, how did you survive? How did one survive from that? He said, of course, 98% is luck. there was a famous Holocaust survivor. He was good. He wrote well. His name was Primo Levi, and he wrote the book. It came to be called something like Life in Auschwitz. I can't remember the exact title. Survival at Auschwitz. Survival. That wasn't the original title, but it was reissued. Survival at Auschwitz, and he was a chemist in Auschwitz, and when they were having the selection who to send to the gas chambers, they would have the people run from point A to point B. The Nazis would have the people run from point A to point B. And those who seemed physically disabled at that point, they were selected. And each of them wore a number on them. So they would choose 14, 12, goes to the gas chamber. And Levy, he was physically feeble, but the guy read the wrong number, the one who was taking notes, and so somebody else went. And I understood what he was trying to say there. He was trying to say 99% was pure luck if you survived. And so when I asked Professor Hilberg, how did people survive? He said, 98% luck. But 2%, the mind works very fast. Should I go to the left? Should I go to the right? Should I go back? Should I go forward? Making these instantaneous decisions, smart decisions. And that was my mother. In moments of crisis, she could be emotionally erratic. She was shattered by the war. But in moments of crisis, the mind focused. She was a mathematician by training. She was studying at Warsaw University mathematics when the war happened, and that mental laser beam, focused. So why do I mention this seemingly absurd or irrelevant digression? Because when she was interviewed by the newscaster Amy Goodman, who at the time was a friend of mine, when she was interviewed, at one point, Amy wanted to shift the subject from something that was so somber that it was clearly affecting my mother emotionally. She wanted to shift the subject, change the subject. And she said to my mother, "So tell me about Liberation Day. It must have been the happiest day of your life." And my mother looked at her in complete bewilderment, consternation. And she said, "Happiest day of my life? It was the most terrible day of my life." And Amy got this completely perplexed look on her face. Terrible? And my mother said, "Of course," because it was at that moment I realized I'm all alone in the world. Her mind for years had just been focused on survival. Running, left, right, forward, back, the bombs dropping in the ghetto. Running. And so with the people of Gaza, if you see the scenes, run here, run there, go there, go to this safe zone. Israel drops the 2,000-pound bombs on the safe zone. Run to that safe zone. Israel doesn't let any food or water. Running, survival. So when that phase ended, and then you saw the scenes of people in Gaza walking to the north from the south to return to their homes, and they suddenly realized there's nothing there. And I think, pure speculation, but I believe they will be shattered and they will want to leave. And that's what Israel is doing now. Turn it into that hellhole and communicating it's not over. The torture is not over. We'll keep turning the screws and turning the screws and turning the screws until you scream and you're ready to go.
On that note, Norman, I know you need to go too. So thank you, as always, for coming and having this conversation with me.